Okay, in terms of stuff, it's always just bad news. Deadline say has been all along. Exam number 1, quizzes part 2, deadline to find October 16th. So not this Friday, or next Friday, but the Friday after that. Exam number 2, quizzes part 3, deadline to find November 13th. Exam 3, exam 4, quizzes part 4, deadline December 4th. And the exciting adventures of exam 5, deadline December 11th afternoon. For the paper, draft deadline, if you wish to do one, November 16th. If you turn in a draft previously, it's in the pickup envelope to my office door. Plus bond deadline is November 18th. Full credit deadline November 25th. And half credit December 4th. And the final version of the paper deadlines at end of day and turned in through Blackboard. Before pressing on to the new stuff, which is more for our good dead friend St. Thomas Aquinas, anything about any previous stuff or stuff to be that needs more stuff. Okay. So this time we're looking at Aquinas talking about ethics and so forth, and we get to the point where he's talking about why there's disagreement. And for Aquinas, the reason why there's disagreement is for the following reasons. As he noted that some people are blinded by passions, some by bad habits, and in some cases by ignorance. And so, in response to the question, if morality is objective, why do people disagree, why do people fail to live up to it, he gives those answers. It's either sort of an emotional thing, the passions lead people astray, or people have bad habits that they've fallen into, or they just don't know what the natural laws are. Now, one kind of interesting part of Aquinas' view is the notion of the conscience. Everyone, of course, is familiar with the great philosopher Jiminy Cricket, who said that your conscience be your God. And one interesting question in ethics is, when we look at someone who's acted in accord with their conscience, even if we disagree with them or think they're wrong, does that make an important moral difference? In other words, is someone who believes they're right and does something we regard as wrong, is there a difference between that and someone who knows they're doing wrong and do wrong anyways? Now, Aquinas believes that if someone is willing in a way out of accord with reason, whether they get it right or wrong, it's always evil, it's always bad. And he takes a view that we're obligated to follow our informed conscience as well as possible. So that idea basically puts sort of, a requirement on it has to be informed. So if someone just says, I thought it was the right thing to do, and they do it, it wouldn't be good enough. The person actually has to put in the appropriate effort to know or try to figure out what the right thing is. Now, of course, it's a very important question. How much effort are we required to put in to know, discern wrong from right? Now, he thinks that if a person does make a mistake, the judgment should be based on how well the person followed the light as they saw it. In other words, if a person acts on her informed conscience and put in the appropriate, as they say in the law, due diligence, and act in accord with what they believe was right, even if it turns out they were wrong, the person should still be regarded as having, in terms of their judgment, based on their informed conscience. Now again, if you're looking for, a paper topic, there are cases you can look at like that, where people, where you may think someone's wrong, but it's an interesting question. Are they acting on their conscience, their informed conscience, or are they aware they're being bad? For example, we take the case of Kim Davis, the clerk who refused to issue same-sex marriage licenses. Her claim is that she's doing what she believes to be right. And would it make a difference if that were true? If she really truly believes she was doing right, even though other people think that she's wrong? That kind of interesting point about morality. Now, we now turn to the 4 laws that Aquinas considers. First one there is the metaphysics. Now, Aquinas, even though he believes that morality is autonomous from God, that it's not divine command theory, that what is good because God says so, bad because God forbids it, he does think that the moral law in us and moral law in the world is an expression of God's eternal law. Now, the reason why he's not a divine command theorist is because he thinks that the moral law is not arbitrarily created by God. God doesn't just say, yeah, let it be this, let it be that, whatever. He thinks that God lays out the natural law based on his reason, based in God's nature. And so, since God is not arbitrary or capricious, on his view, neither is the law. So, God does still create the moral law, but it's not just, the law is not just whatever it is he wants. His reason tells him what is truly good, and he makes it so. Or at least as Aquinas sees it. Now, the four different laws are these: the eternal law, the natural law, the divine law, and the human law. The eternal law is this: it is the rational order that God established for the world that God created. And this includes, all the laws governing all this stuff. Small things follow this law. Now, non-rational things just follow the law, because they're not rational. They don't get to decide. So, for example, if you take an object, drop it, it doesn't decide, hey, I'll fall because that's the way the law works. It just does what it does. Now, the moral aspects of the law, though, are things that we as humans can choose to obey or disobey. Free will. We can decide to be good or decide to be bad. So eternal law is, God's law, laid down, covering everything. Now, the second type of law is a subset of eternal law. It's the natural law. This is what governs our behavior. Well, it's supposed to govern our behavior. And reason, according to Aquinas, can figure out what this is. So, to use a crappy analogy, just as we can figure out the laws of physics or chemistry by reason, we can also figure out the natural laws by reason and know what we should and should not do. Now, these laws cover us in the natural world. So this would be like birth to death, mortal life. Now, what about, beyond that? Because as I mentioned, what Aquinas is doing is taking the Aristotle pagan, cake and putting on a layer of Christianity. So the natural law is the same stuff, at least as Aquinas sees it, that Aristotle would accept. How we should be as natural beings, to be fully excellent and be happy. Now, since Aquinas is a Christian, he adds in divine law. So, what's this? Well, for Aquinas, divine law by revelation. So, it's revealed. It goes beyond the natural law because it's aimed at not happiness here in our mortal life, but aimed at eternal happiness. And he adds in the upper layer, the Christian layer, the layer cake, 3 new virtues: faith, hope, and love. And these virtues are only attainable not through our own efforts, but through God's grace. So in the natural law stuff, the natural law, it's Aristotle. You want to be brave, engage in brave actions, you become brave. But in order to achieve the eternal happiness, according to Aristotle, that's all up to God. We can't, develop those virtues on our own through efforts here. They should be provided by divine grace. And so this is what relates to the religious aspect. So the next layer on the cake. Lastly, human law. These are laws that are created by us. Now, one interesting and important debate today in sensitive people is, what is the foundation, if any, for human law? Do we just make crap up and just make up the rules, and it's like a game of Monopoly. We're just making crap up because we got to have rules. Or is there something underlying it that grounds and warrants our rules, something beyond just making crap up? Now, Aquinas, being a saint, not surprisingly thinks that anything that is truly lawful in human laws comes from the eternal law, comes from God. So all that is right and good and just in our laws come from God. So, theological foundation. Now this, of course, does raise the practical question. A person could accept that the foundation of human laws, their validity rests on God. But they might disagree when it comes to particular laws, in terms of which laws of the eternal law are real and which ones do we just think are real. So, for example, it's, there are dietary restrictions, in certain religions. And a good question would be as well, is God really worried about that? Is God really worried about whether you have lobster or not? And so a person could believe, the claim that human law, whatever's good about it, comes from the eternal law, but they might disagree with what particular laws really are real for real. And just because someone believes, human laws should reflect divine law, doesn't mean the person has to accept that everything claimed by particular religions has to be law. But it does take the view that whatever is truly good and just in human law comes from eternal law. Okay, before pressing on to the Summa Theologica, anything about setup that needs more setup stuff? Okay. Now we go to a thin slice from St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, kind of blending my words. Now, he begins this slice by asking the question of whether there is an eternal law or not. And he looks at what it is to be a law. And he defines a law in the following way. It's a dictator of reason, emanating from the ruler who governs a perfect community. Now, being, a devout believer, he grants, assumes, accepts that the world is ruled by divine providence. And so everything is ruled by divine reason. And so, he believes the very idea of the government of things and God, the rule of the universe, has the nature of a law. So, law is a dictated reason from the ruler to the ruled, and since he believes in God, he believes God is ruling the universe. So pretty clearly, you got law. Now then the question is, and Aquinas is always super careful. He's following the Greek method of philosophy, which is you got to argue everything. The question is the law eternal? And he refers to Proverbs, which of course says the divine reason's conception of things is not subject to time, but is eternal. So we get a law, because we got God, he's the ruler of the stuff, and the divine reason of things is eternal according to the Bible. So the law, you get a law, and you got eternal law. So problem solved. Now, what about the natural law stuff? Well, kind of the way this works for Aquinas is this. All of natural things, you, me, kiwis, both the fruit and the bird, we all partake in the eternal law to the degree we derive our inclinations to our proper ends. So basically, to use a craft analogy, kind of like our excellence, our programming, so to speak, or what we should be, is set by that eternal law. And that tells us what we should be. And, much like Aristotle, he believes that this gives us our end or goal. So what should we be? Well, it's set by eternal law. And each of us, in a way, have like our mission objectives set in us, and that part of it is the natural law, what we should be here in this world. How do we find out? Well, what he claims is this. Now, it's a good question, because we want to know, like, what's good, what's evil, how do we know? So how do we know? How do we tell what's good and what's bad? Because people claim all kinds of things. To take, current controversies, some claim that same-sex marriage is wrong. Some claim that it's acceptable. Some people claim that guns are bad. Some people claim that guns are a basic right. And so pretty much anything we talk about, people disagree. Some think it's good, some people think it's evil. So how do we know? Well, for Aquinas, he claims we have this feature called the light of natural reason, by which we discern good and evil. And it's an imprint from the divine light. A good question might be like, what's that? Well, here's kind of its pedigree. Way back in the time of Plato, Plato had this thing called the allegory of the cave. If you had intro class or read some Plato, probably heard of it. Or if you've seen the movie The Matrix, you've seen it with a big budget, guns, lots of guns. The idea of Plato is that there is the good, which illuminates the truly real world. And it works by analogy like the sun. The way we see stuff, without artificial lighting, is by the sun illuminating things that we can see. And Plato said, by analogy, the good illuminates the truly real world, enable us to metaphorically see. Now, this notion of there being a natural light kind of stuck, and philosophers throughout the centuries, accepted it. Descartes did, and it's even in popular culture. For example, if you're drawing a cartoon and you want to show a character getting an idea, what do you draw in the little bubble over their head? You draw a light bulb. They have become enlightened. And that traces back to Plato, weirdly enough. So Aquinas thinks we have built into us that faculty, that natural light. You can think of it, to use like an analogy, think of it like a searchlight shining in the darkness, or a lighthouse shining on a dark ocean. And the idea is that it reveals to us what is good and what is evil. So crudely put, we have built within us the faculty for discerning good from evil, embedded in us or imbued in us by God, which I guess would be pretty handy. Now, of course, there is the fair question of whether we really got that or not. And a good question would be, how would you know for sure if you're really detecting good or detecting evil? Now, people often think they're sure, but then other people totally disagree with them and think they're totally sure. So that is a core question. How do we tell good from evil, and how do we know? And Aquinas' answer is the natural light, not the beard.
It's like instinct?
Yeah, it could be seen as kind of an instinct thing. You just know. People know wrong from right. And then when they think otherwise, they're just trying to be tricky or trick themselves. The second thing he considers is, again, the formal question, whether laws are aimed at making us good. And he thinks, yes. A law, again, is a dictate by the ruler by which the subjects are governed. And he believes that the virtue of any subordinated thing is to be well subordinated to what regulates it. And, again, following Plato and Aristotle, he goes to the idea that, going back to our good friend Plato, Plato believed that the person had three metaphysical parts. You get a reasoning part, a spirited part, and a desiring part. If you're familiar with psychology, a good dead friend, Sigmund Freud, you've got the id, the ego, and superego. So Freud's just stealing Plato. Plus doing cocaine. He's stealing from Plato. Doing cocaine, stealing from Plato. It's like grand theft of philosophy. But no hookers were killed, I don't think. But who knows? He's right. So, what Plato believed is that the lesser parts, the other parts, the desiring part and the spirited part, were supposed to serve reason. So the idea was that the spirited part would team up with the reasoning part and keep the desiring part under control. Now, Aristotle takes a similar view. He says, just as the reason is supposed to regulate, the desiring part, he believes that what's subordinated should obey what subordinates it. Or so he believes. Now, we also take it from Aristotle is that being a good subject involves properly following the ruler. Now, you may think, well, what about like awful rulers? Think of like, tyrants and dictators and so forth. Now, Aquinas, of course, does consider that the virtue of the subject is following, the ruler, but the proper end of the law is to make people properly virtuous, and virtue is supposed to make people good. So then it gives rise to the question, So does this mean we're supposed to just like obey whoever happens to be in charge, whatever dictator or tyrant comes along? Well, this is where he brings up an important point about goodness in the state. When he says this, he believes, following St. Augustine, not the place in Florida, but that guy, that since every person is supposed to be part of the state, which is a major assumption, that the good, to be good, a person must be what he says, well proportioned to the common good. That essentially his view is that the people running the show have to be virtuous, and the citizens have to be good, or at least good enough to follow virtuous leaders. So he sort of addresses the problem of, should we just like obey tyrants and, dictators and so forth? And his view is, well, if they're tyrants and dictators, they're not doing what they should do. Because, like Aristotle, he believes the proper end of the state is the good, the common good, the good of the people. And in order to bring this about, much like Confucius, the rulers have to be virtuous, because bad rulers will do bad things. And then, if you have good rulers, the people have to be at least good enough to follow the rulers. So he envisions a just state, with just rulers and citizens who are good, or at least good enough to follow just rulers. So that brings us to the important point of tyranny, tyrannical law. Now when we get to part 4, we're looking at obedience and disobedience, to authority, but Aquinas brings up a bit here. It does raise that important question. Can there be unjust, as I say, tyrannical laws? Now, some people have the view that the state, whatever the state says is right, because it's the state. Might makes right. Which is one view. So what does Aquinas think? Well, what makes a tyrannical law for him is this. It is one that's not in accord with reason. So it is not a law, but a perversion of law. But, in as far as it aims at the good of the citizens, it has something in the nature of a law. So, what it's got is basically something that's intended to be obeyed, but tyrannical means it's out of accord with reason. What does that mean? Well, again, his view is that the objective of the state is goodness. So proper laws aim at the good of the people, the good of the state. And so a law that doesn't do that is still a law because it aims to be obeyed. People don't pass laws with intent people disobeying them, but it doesn't fulfill the proper function of law, being out of accord with reason. And so we see in Aquinas what some might regard as a starting point for the idea of unjust laws, which later evolves to the notion that we can disobey unjust laws, and which we'll see will tie in later to civil disobedience. Now, if you're still looking for paper topics, one thing that is always potentially of interest is various laws. I mean, there are laws, people are against certain laws. Laws say like regarding, popular ones would be like same-sex marriage ones, drug laws, etc. And one way to look at them is, as Aquinas says, does this law aim towards the common good? If the answer is yes, you could say it's a good law. If it doesn't, if it's a destructive effect, you could argue that it is a tyrannical law, an unjust law. Before pressing on, anything about this stuff that needs any more stuff? Now, he next turns to the question, he likes questions, is whether the natural law contains several precepts or one only. Now, as I mentioned, one important question is, how do you know what's good or bad, right and wrong? And he brings up the idea of the natural light that shows us the good, the bad, and presumably the ugly. Now, he also makes the claim that natural law is self-evident. So the way we know the natural law is in the following way. Now, good question is, so what's self-evident? We might be inclined to think it's something that is like obvious, but it's actually different. Because self-evident, obvious just means you just you just see it. It's clear, and just, looking at it, you see what it is. Now, self-evident is different, though. What would be an example of a self-evident proposition, and what does it mean? Well, first, what does it mean? Well, what it means is this. A self-evident proposition is such that if you understand what it means, you would see through your understanding that it's true. And I'll use like a non-controversial example. Take like triangle. We know a triangle is a three-sided figure. And when we understand that, we know the claim that triangles have three sides is true. It's self-evident. Now, self-evident things may not be obvious. For example, take like a logical, theorem or axiom. Now, when people are really good at like logic and math, the things that are very difficult, they'll say, oh, this is just self-evident. Or as they often say in philosophy, oh, it's just trivial. But if you don't know that stuff, it's not obvious. But the idea is basically once you fully understand it, then you're like, oh yeah, that's just totally self-evident. So self-evident doesn't mean just like obvious or easily known. It means once you fully understand it, you would see the truth. Now, there of course is dispute about whether there are such things that are self-evident. Some of course say yes, some say no. Now for Aquinas, what are some examples of things that are supposed to be self-evident? Well, one is this. He claims the claim, man as a rational being is self-evident. Because, roughly put, by definition, if you say man, you say rational being. Another example would be, not from Aquinas, but one that kind of illustrates it. Think of like bachelor unmarried man. If someone is truly a bachelor, it is self-evident they are an unmarried man. Why? Because that's what it means. You'll never have a bachelor who is married. You might have someone claiming to be a bachelor who's married, but you'll never find someone who truly is a bachelor being married. Now, he gives some examples of ones that would require some work to know. For example, he says, to those who understand that angels aren't physical beings, they would understand and see as self-evident that angels aren't in places. I mean, everyone's probably heard the thing, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? And if they don't have any corporeal form, then the answer would be infinite. If they wouldn't. But the other thing is, if you don't have a body, can you actually dance? Point question. Not really. But. So he thinks that some things are self-evident. And he thinks the precepts of the natural law are self-evident. Now this explains like a couple things. One is, how do we know? Well, you can be sure because it's self-evident. Then the question is, why don't some people know? Well, self-evident doesn't mean easy. It can be very, very difficult. So the idea would be is people just don't understand it. Just like with math. Someone who's brilliant in math, they're like, oh, this is all just self-evident. Other people are like, what? I'm getting I'm mathing wrong. So what are the principles of practical reason? Some examples of these things. Well, the first one he claims is this. The good is that which all things seek after. The first precept of the law is, good is to be done and pursued, and evil to be avoided. And so he thinks we can kind of roll through everything like that, to see basically through reasoning through this stuff, what it is that is, and what it is that should be done. So, if we see as self-evident that good is what all things seek, then that tells us, at least according to him, that we should do good and avoid evil. And he thinks we can kind of roll through all the stuff and figure that stuff out. Now, of course, again, there's still the practical problem of, well, does everyone agree about what we should be doing and what we shouldn't be doing?
No.
No. So either it's not self-evident, or some people are just totally wrong about stuff. Now, I mentioned before the problem of evil and stuff. So, what about good and evil? Well, he looks at it this way. Good, he claims, is like is an end, something we achieve, try to achieve. And evil is the opposite. And he also took the view, common during this time period, that he was Aquinas in, that evil is a privation or a lack. And as you might imagine, one of the big questions in ethics is, what is good? Another is, what is evil? And Aquinas assumes that good is what we aim for. And not in the sense that you aim for it, it's good. His view is that if it's good, then that's what we should aim for. And he takes evil to be an absence or a lack, which, again, as I mentioned previously, goes back to the problem of evil. If God is so good, all-powerful, and knowing, why is there bad stuff? Now, he also claims that we have an inclination to do good. Why? Well, one part of this, he claims, in a common view in this theological view, is that all things seek to preserve themselves. And so, again, his view is basically we can look at what is and infer what we ought to do. So, if things try to preserve themselves, then what we ought to do is preserve human life. We also, as we saw before, given our inclinations to live in society, know about God, then we should be inclined to avoid ignorance, to avoid offending people with whom we live, and to do things that help us live in society. Well, so he claims. So again, kind of his approach is, in a way, almost like an empirical approach to ethics. We kind of look at what we do and how things work and what we are, and figure out from that what we should do. So, we mentioned before, if you try to kill something, it will probably either run away or try to kill you right back. Therefore, according to Aquinas, we should infer that things are to be preserved, so we should actually preserve ourselves and others. Final thing for Aquinas, he asks the question whether the natural law is the same in all men. His answer is the same. But again, there's a question of, so why do people not all agree? Which is a good question. Because if you're an objectivist about ethics, and you believe there's an objective fact of the matter about good and evil, right and wrong, you have to account for why people disagree. And the answer that Aquinas gives is this. As we saw before, either it's because of what he calls rectitude, that people, passions blind them or habits interfere with them, or it's a matter of knowledge. They are operating in ignorance. And so he claims that morality is the same for everyone, and if people differ, they're getting it wrong because either they don't know, or they have some sort of defect. But we could use the analogy to math. We assume math is objective, that there's correct or incorrect answers. And if people get it wrong, we don't assume math is subjective, we infer that the person must have done something, made some error. That's our good friend Thomas Aquinas. Wrote a lot of stuff, had a divine revelation that told him everything he did was worthless. Then he died, became a saint, and is still dead and still a saint today. Before swinging over to divine command theory, anything about St. Thomas Aquinas that needs more Aquinas stuff? Now, an opposing viewpoint in ethics is the classic divine command theory, which I mentioned, numerous occasions because it's, pretty useful stuff. Now, the definition is straightforward. We've seen this before. The idea is that good, what makes something good, is that God commands it. So the fact that he commands it makes it good. Why is this good? Because God says so. In regards to what is bad, God's forbiddance makes it bad. Why is this bad? God forbids it, says it's bad. Now, since God is perfectly good, one reason to think that divine command theory makes sense is because if God is perfectly good, what he commanded would be perfectly good. His commands are universal, because he's God. They're impartial, and they're overriding. Now, in terms of how morality is supposed to work in divine command theory, usually there are divine agents that enforce the stuff. You've got, angels, agents of punishment would be like, devils and demons and stuff. Now, why do people like divine command theory? Well, first reason is this. One, it provides a definite foundation for ethics, namely God. Two, if we take seriously God's existence, and we believe that God is omnipotent and the ruler of the universe, it seems to follow, divine command theory, you might say, seems to follow. If God is all-powerful, you might say, he can do anything. And if he's in charge of the universe, he makes the rules. Thirdly, God is supposed to be perfect. And the idea that there could be something else independent of God, like morality, might strike some as implausible. It also answers the question, why be good? Because if divine command theory is true, usually you're going along with this, if you do what God says, reward. Typically, we call heaven. If you don't do what God says to do, punishment in the form of hell. So there's your motivation to be good. Get heaven, avoid hell. Now, there are critics who will say that that's not really being good. Because if you're just going along with the rules to get a reward and to avoid being punished, that's just practicality, good sense, and not morality. That morality requires doing good for the sake of goodness, as opposed to doing good to avoid, being punished. So what's our sample philosopher for divine command theory? Well, it's someone you've heard of, although you might not realize you've heard of him. And it's the dead philosopher John Duns Scotus. Born in 1266, died in 1308. He was a monk in the Franciscan order. He studied at Oxford and Paris, lectured and wrote at Oxford, Paris, and Cologne. And the reason why you've heard about him, even though you might not realize you've heard about him, was because he was a very popular fellow back in the day, and his followers called themselves duncemen, or dunces. Now you may think, why would people call themselves dunces? That's an insult. The usual picture is the person in the corner with a pointy hat on with dunce on it. Your dunces are supposed to be stupid. Now, if you wonder where the connection is, here's the connection. Back when John Donne was gunning, being a dunceman or a dunce was not considered a bad thing, because people generally don't refer to themselves with derogatory terms. But what happened was, after Scotus was dead, and the philosophical view, known as scholasticism, kind of fell out of favor, the folks during the Enlightenment and Renaissance regarded the scholastics who followed John Donne as being stupid, impediments to progress. And so dunceman and dunce became synonymous with being stupid. And so we still use the term dunce today, and the origin goes back to John Duns Scotus. So, useful bit of trivia there. Now, what is John Duns Scotus? We'll flip my words around. John Duns Scotus's stuff. Well, back in the ancient days, a couple of days ago, we were talking about voluntarism versus intellectualism, and I mentioned that one camp of thinkers took the view that God's intellect is supreme, that he will not, his being all-powerful means he can do anything that's possible. The opposing view is that being all-powerful means he can do anything, even the impossible. Now, Scotus fell firmly in the camp that the will is the highest aspect of the soul. Aquinas, in contrast, following Aristotle, took the view that the intellect is the highest aspect of the soul. And Aquinas assumed, like the Greeks did, that we always will the good, that we're like auto-willing the good. It's like setting our preferences. Auto-will the good, yes. And so we're always seeking the good. Where we screw up, though, is we fail in our understanding. We're always willing the good, but we get it wrong, or our passions or bad habits interfere. But for Scotus, he believes the will is the highest aspect. So what's his argument for will over intellect? Well, here's how he argues. First, he claims that knowledge is not the ruler. The will is the ruler. because the knowledge is but an instrument of the will. He claims what the intellect does, it's like a personal assistant or a shopper, personal shopper. The intellect brings before the will various options. Or like when you go on Amazon, people who bought this also bought this type of deal. And it brings you various options you can select from. But it's up to the will to choose between them. So the will is the decider, the intellect is merely the personal shopper, going out and bringing it options. Or so he claims. Secondly, he claims the will moves the intellect. We will what we're going to think about. So the intellect is not in charge, it merely does the work of the will. To use another crappy analogy, it's like the intellect is like a research assistant. And the will tells the intellect what to go and do. Thirdly, he claims the will is free and cannot be determined by anything, even the intellect. Now Aquinas, as I mentioned, bought on the view that the will basically is aimed at the good. You know, again, going with my crappy computer analogy or smartphone analogy, where our preferences are always set to seek the good. In fact, it's not even a preference, we do that, it's built in, seek the good. But Scotus claims the will is not determined by knowledge of the good. It chooses or doesn't choose the good based on a free decision. So, the idea is that, contrary to Aquinas, we're not good seekers automatically. We will whatever we choose to will. Again, Aquinas' assumption was we auto-will the good. And Scotus says, nope, we get the will, you may will the good, you may not. Fourthly, the intellect, he claims, is determined by the object of knowledge. In other words, you know what you know. But the will can accept or reject anything. It's totally free. So the total cause of the willing is in the will itself. Now, of course, this ties into debates about free will. Do we have how free are we? And Scotus buys into the kind of what we consider the classic view of free will. That the will is totally free and totally undetermined. We are completely free. Now, of course, not everyone buys that. But if you do accept the supremacy of the will, that we can will anything, and the will is unconstrained, then all the rest of this kind of follows. And it's still a popular view today. People still really like free will. Now, as I mentioned before, Aquinas would be considered under the camp of intellectualism. God's intellect over his will, we ought to will the good, and our intellect, tells us what is good or what is bad. Although sometimes it screws it up. Whereas for Scotus, it's we can will whatever, good, bad, whatever. Now this is because Scotus is a voluntarist. Now again, this doesn't mean someone who volunteers for a lot of stuff and has a lot of community spirit. It's the view that that God's will is above his intellect, and God can will anything, even the impossible. Now Aquinas, as we saw, believed that morality was based on a natural inclination to seek happiness, and taking that from Aristotle. Scotus offers us something less pleasant. He claims, in contrast to Aristotle and Aquinas, that morality might require us to do things that are contrary to our happiness. That being good may make us very, very sad indeed. So somewhat less appealing. Moral obligations for Scotus rest not on our happiness, but on God's commands. Aquinas also held that the moral law can be found in human nature. God constructs us in accord with his reason. Built within that is our tendency, our seeking of the good. And so we can examine, just to use a crappy analogy, just like we've got, DNA that we can examine and figure out our biology, we have built into us our nature that we can examine and see what we should do. And this will make us happy. And Scotus says, he rejects that. He says, there's no natural way to determine the moral truths. Why not? Well, voluntarism. Now, for Scotus, God is omnipotent, means that God can will anything, even the impossible. He is free, totally, and omnipotent. So, reason is useless. Reason can't tell you what God is trying to do, what his actions are. It can't tell us anything. Because since everything is contingent on what God happened to will, there is no logical necessity in the world. What does that mean? Well, philosophers like to throw out terms like necessity and contingency. And here's the idea. We normally think of something necessary means you gotta have it, like food and shelter and so forth. But it also means something else in a more technical sense. Something that is necessarily the case, or necessarily true, is something that always has to be and can't be anything different. For example, we think of, suppose I draw a triangle on the board, and I put my hand on it, and I say, how many sides does the triangle have? Without looking, you'll say, 3. Because triangles have to have 3 sides. If it's not 3-sided, it's not a triangle. If it's a triangle, it's 3-sided. And that'd be an example of something that's necessarily true. It's impossible to have a triangle with more or less than 3 sides. Now, there are some things that are contingent. That means they could be, but they don't have to be. So I can make the triangle big or small. Its size is contingent. Now, some philosophers believe in necessary truths. Truths that are true, and you can know them by, they're called a priori truths. And these are things that you supposedly can know by pure reason. And again, an example is like the triangle being 3-sided. You don't have to see it to know it's 3-sided. Reason tells you they're 3-sided. Now, where the big debate occurs is whether you can know things about the world. So it's easy to know, okay, triangle's 3-sided, by definition. Bachelors are unmarried, by definition. But can you know things about the world? Like, for example, one big question is, does God exist? Some will claim you can know that a priori. Some will claim you can't. Some people like Descartes believed you could sit down and reason from I think, therefore am, to all kinds of other stuff. And so one of the big debates in philosophy is, how much can reason tell us about the world? Now, Scotus claims, since God could do anything, create the world any way, the world could be any way. We can't tell by pure reason the way things are. So what does that mean? Well, and why does he believe that? Well, here's how he argues. If God's choices were actually logically necessary, if God had to be a certain way, then we could figure out the world the same way we could figure out a geometric proof. If you had geometry or logic, you can sit down and do proofs just in your mind. You don't have to go out and look and see if 2 + 2 is 4, or triangles with 3 sides. You can do all these proofs purely in your mind, a priori. And Scotus says, well, if God was logically necessary and to work everything out in accord with these rational principles, we could sit down and do the whole thing for the world, figure it all out by sitting in an armchair, just thinking real hard about it. And Scotus says we can't do this, so it follows that God is totally free, since we can't do that. Now, there are people who think we can do that. People who do physics just pure mathematics. They would believe you can figure out reality by a priori means. Others say, no, you got to go out and look at stuff. So, what then do we have for morality? Well, as we're running out of time, we shall pick up with on Monday, finishing up John Duns Scotus, and then we'll look at some problems with divine command theory, and then we'll move on to some more stuff. So have a good weekend, whatever good might be. And whatever weekend might be.
Is there a attendance?
Yeah, it's out there somewhere.